Hello, good morning everyone. I'm going to do my usual and just wait for a couple of seconds before I launch into this subject. So welcome to this week's Learn With Lorna. I'm going to open with the phrase you'll now be familiar with, and you'll hear me say it a couple of times throughout this, but just before I go into any longer subject matter, just to let you know that this live cast is being brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and the event requires no payment and is subscription free. So all you need to do is log on, as some of you are doing already, to our Facebook page or onto the High Life Highland YouTube channel to view this and all previous films. For those of you who are new to the series, my name's Lorna Steele. I'm the Community Engagement Officer for the Highland Archive Service. It's nice already to see everyone's hellos coming in, and now because I've seen some of you commenting before, I know where you're from. So I know Carolyn, you're in, can you see? So it's nice to see people's hellos coming in. So as usual, I'll ask you to please carry on doing that, because it's really, really nice for me to see that people are watching and where they're watching from. So yeah, so for those of you who haven't been involved in the series before, we have covered all sorts of different subjects. So if you want to have a look back at that, we've covered letters and diaries and transport and how to research your local area, World War I, World War II, all sorts of different subjects. And this week, we're looking at poor relief records. Those of you who were here for Victorians Week will remember we touched on this. I don't know why I keep saying we, because it's just me talking at you all the time. I am aware of that. So yes, I've touched on poor relief records briefly in Victorians Week, but this week I'll be going into it in more detail. What I'm going to do is go into a breakdown of how the system worked, how people could claim poor relief, and then go on to some stories from those records. Morning everyone, nice still seeing all your hellos coming in, Orkney and Australia and Inverness and all sorts of places, so that's really nice. We're forming like a wee community, seeing the same names coming up every week and then seeing different names sometimes too. So some of you maybe will be familiar with the word pauper. You'll have come across that possibly on a census or on a death certificate, something like that, and maybe sometimes don't know exactly what that word means. And so that's what we're going to talk about this week. So a pauper is anybody who's claiming poor relief or poor assistance at the time that record was made. So whether that's a death certificate, a census entry, if they're recorded as a pauper, it's because at the time that record was made, they were claiming assistance from the poor relief system. So as I say, I'm going to go on and talk about how that system worked, and then some examples of stories from the collections. As I did in Mental Health Week with the stories from the asylum records, I want to make it very clear that what I'm doing here is showing the types of information that can be found within the collection. What I'm absolutely not doing is doing a showcase of any kind of entertainment value of what people have lived through in the past. We're very conscious every time we look at those records that these, as with the asylum records, these show people at a low point in their life. They show people who are desperate or struggling or have had to fall back on the state system for support. They're emotional records. They are difficult often when family historians come in to look at them and find out that a member of their family had been at such a point of desperation that they had been in this system. And so I'm very, very conscious of that when I talk about poor relief records. So from the system point of view, the key date, and I know throughout this course of talks I've thrown a lot of key dates at you, but the key date from a poor relief point of view is 1845. If you remember from Church Week, prior to this, it was the church who had control of poor relief assistance. They controlled and administered monies to people who needed poor relief right up until the Royal Inquiry of 1843 took that authority away from them and gave the authority to the state. And so that was 1843, the inquiry, but 1845 was the passing of the Poor Law Scotland Act. This created a system of parochial boards, which later became known as parish councils, which was a group of people in each parish, in each civil parish, who administered a fund of money and could support the people who needed it. There was a central board established at this time as well that was based in Edinburgh, and that oversaw the practice of the parochial boards. As you may remember from other weeks like Family History, where we talked about the statutory registers, from Education Week, Health Week, and so on, this period of the mid-19th century is when you start to see a big move towards state control of these sorts of things, the start of the welfare state, control being taken away from churches and other institutions. And you start to see much more standardised record keeping coming in across all of these subjects. And poor relief is the same. This is the period that the record keeping changes from being a little bit sporadic in the church records and a little bit dependent on the person who's writing them, and starts to become much more standardised in set formulaic ways. Much of the actual support that people were given remained the same, but it was they changed who was administering it and who was giving it. People often went to the poor relief system when they were at their most desperate, as I've already said. So either when they were ill, when they were too old to work anymore or earn any money, or when they were temporarily incapacitated. So this could be a brief illness. This could also be, in the case of a woman, if she was pregnant or was, as they termed it, burdened with a young child. So this just meant if she had some reason that meant she couldn't earn her own money. So this kind of comes back to why would you start looking in the poor relief records in the first place? And there's a couple of reasons. You might come across the trigger word, and the main trigger word here is pauper. If you find that in a certificate, in a document, that would lead you to look into poor relief records. But it might also be that you know of a change of circumstances in the person you're looking for. So if you know that there is an illegitimate baby being born, if you know that a husband who might be the main wage earner at the time has died, then it might be worth looking for the widow in the poor relief records. You can also just go on an educated guess. If you've got a family member or someone you're interested in who you know is at an advanced age, it's worth a look in case they appear in those records. I'll caveat that, as you'll be used to me doing by now, with a couple of things. One is that these records, like the health records, are closed for 100 years. That's for data protection reasons. As I said, this is a lot of confidential and personal information about people at a difficult point in their life. So there is a 100-year closure on these records, but that still means just now you can access up to 1920. And also, as I have said previously, as with all archive research, there is the caveat that this depends on what records have survived. So for some records, we have some parishes, very extensive records, and for some, very little because it's not survived. So that's a caveat, as I say, you'll be used to hearing me say by now. I'll be talking, when I come to the stories section here, I'll pull some from Inverness records, but also some from across the beautiful county of Sutherland. So first of all, the process. So how did people go about claiming for poor relief if they found themselves in the position that they needed to do so? So the first stage was to apply. And these, from an archive point of view, these records are kept within the records of application volumes. The records of application are split by parish and borough, and they record who's applying, why they're applying, their age, where they live. So quite a lot of detail about what has taken that person to that point that they need to apply to the poor relief system. They also contain details of what their eligibility is. So people had to prove that they were eligible to claim for help from a particular parish. So this could either be that they had been resident there for 7 years, or that it was their parish of birth. And so quite often you'll see arguments about this where people are trying to shunt someone onto another parish to claim off them instead. The applications for poor relief will also include information about other possible sources of income that person has. So it will record if they have children who they could be relying on, if they have other family members who could be supporting them, because obviously what the parish is trying to do is protect its finances and say, if you have anyone else who can be helping you, they can help you. So that record of application would have an initial assessment by the Inspector of Poor. They would then go back to the rest of the council, the parochial board or the parish council, and discuss that. So those discussions can be found within the parochial board minutes. They record any reasons that they're talking about a particular case, if there's any debate about it, if a person who's claiming has children that the board think, well, that child could be helping them rather than us. As I say, they're trying to prevent people using the system except as a last resort. That's also where you find kind of negotiations about two parishes where they'll say, yes, they've lived here for this amount of time, but they've been, not resident the whole time, or yes, they're resident here now, but it's only been 6 years, so we're going to track down the parish they were born in. That sort of thing appears within the minutes. The next volume to look at, if a person is accepted into the poor relief system, is they appear on the General Register of Poor for that parish or that borough. So as I say, that's only if they're successful. If they're not successful, the applications will mark that. So if they're accepted, they get put onto the General Register of Poor. This records, again, a lot of details about them, about their religion, about their name, address, age, occupation, things like that. Other references to family members, and details of the assistance that's given to them. And so this is split into indoor relief or outdoor relief. Outdoor relief was when people were given support in the form of clothing or school fees for their children, money, medication, things like that would be classed as outdoor relief. It just meant that they were being assisted while staying in their own house. Indoor relief was when people were taken into the poorhouses. And if any of you are watching from England, and I see there's people there from Berkshire and different places, so if you're watching from England, the workhouses that you know in England are poorhouses in Scotland, so we don't have anything under the term of workhouse. We have poorhouses. So the 1845 Act, which I mentioned at the beginning, is the key date. That made provision for every parish to build a poorhouse to house their paupers, or for several parishes to get together and use their funding to create a combined poorhouse. As you can imagine, across the kind of disparate areas of the Highland, there were several combined poorhouses because of the geography. And because your average rural parish is not going to have hundreds and hundreds of paupers at one time. The poorhouse regime was strict. Again, it's not perhaps the image that we have of the kind of workhouse, Oliver Twist sort of thing, but it was strict and it was harsh. And again, the reason for that was to discourage use, to protect the resources and the money. But if people were in there, they did get free medical care and they did get free meals. So although it was hard, it had its benefits to those people who were desperate. I'm going to talk just briefly about Inverness Poorhouse as the biggest one in the Highlands. From 1845 for 10 or 15 years, they hadn't, obviously the Act was passed in 1845, they hadn't yet built a poorhouse, and so they used Dunbar's Hospital. And so for anyone who's familiar with Inverness, that's on Church Street. It's been used as all sorts of things, from a school to a hospital to a cafe to all sorts of things. If you're not familiar with Inverness, I would encourage you to Google that or look that up, because it's a really beautiful building on Church Street, Dunbar's Hospital. And so that was used initially as the Inverness Poorhouse, and it had provision for 50 sick or infirm paupers. In 1962, the purpose-built poorhouse was built in Inverness. That went on to become the Hilton Hospital, but I'll touch on that in a second. And the first governor and matron were Mr. and Mrs. McPhee. They came together, obviously, as a married couple and had a combined salary of £120 per year. As I said, the regime in the poorhouse could be quite strict. There was punishment and reward system, so people could be put into solitary confinement if they didn't behave as the system expected. But they could also be given extra food, extra snuff, extra tobacco if they were seen to be productive and useful members of the poorhouse community. Inverness Poorhouse also had a garden where they had pigs and they grew vegetables, again similar to when we talked about the asylum a few weeks ago. And what's nice from a local point of view about that is in 1862, when it was built, it was advisors, foremen from Howden's Garden Centre who came to advise about the garden. And again, for those of you who are from the Highlands, you'll know that we still have Howden's Garden Centre, a local company with a long history. So it's nice to see that in those records that they were involved from that date of supporting the poorhouse. An example of how education was given in the poorhouse, that one of the early residents was a gentleman called Thomas Ross, and he was a clerk, but he'd also had experience of teaching, and so he was asked to give lessons to the children who were resident in the poorhouse, which he did until his departure. After that, the children in the Inverness poorhouse went to Raining School for education and then to Kilcabook School after that. As I said, the poorhouse, I was going to say the asylum again, I was like, no, I'm not on asylum, I'm not talking about asylum this week. The poorhouse did have that kind of reputation of being harsh and quite prison-like and severe. And so in 1911, there were deliberate changes made to that to make it feel less like that. It had a library installed, and this was the first time of any institution like this actually in Scotland that the address for people born in the poorhouse on their birth certificate was changed. So it no longer said born in Inverness Poorhouse, it said born at 40 Old Edinburgh Road. And they did that deliberately because they felt there was a stigma attached to being born in the poorhouse that would possibly go with that person through the rest of their life, and they were trying to remove that. By 1921, the poorhouse had become known as the Muirfield Institution. It then went on in the 1960s to become the Hilton Hospital. So again, any of you familiar with Inverness will know that. If you're not familiar, again, it's a beautiful building to have a look at, Inverness Poorhouse or Hilton Hospital. A really beautiful building and quite typical of poorhouse buildings at the time. It finally closed in 1987 as a health care building. So I'm going to go on now to talk about some of the examples of stories from within the collection, but before I do so, as I warned, I just want to remind you that this livecast is being brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and this event requires no payment and no subscription. So just come along and join us either now or later. Okay, so I'm going to look at some of the stories that can be found in these collections. And as I mentioned, I'm going to pull some examples from Sutherland Records initially. Quite a lot of these things, obviously they give insights into individual stories and into the stories of families, but sometimes they can give insights into what's happening in an area. So if there is a particularly bad time of crop failure or something like that, then you might be able to see what's happening through these records. Sometimes you can see what's predominant in an area, trades, things like that. So for instance, in the Lairg, I can hear everybody in Lairg correcting me to Lurg pronunciation. In the Lairg records, you can see the predominance of people called Mackay in the Poor Relief records. And that's to be completely expected by those of us who know the area, because that's a very prolific local surname. So you can see things like that, little glimpses into social history in these records as well. I'm going to talk about some stories from the Kildonan records. For those of you not familiar with the Highlands, Kildonan is a parish in Sutherland up on the east coast, the right-hand side of Sutherland, and it's one of the most north parishes within Sutherland. It shares a boundary with the county of Caithness. As you might expect from a coastal parish, a lot of the people within the poor relief records for Kildonan are fishermen, there are crofters, there's quite a few people listed as tramps as well who are travelling through the district. And as you can imagine from what I've said about eligibility, quite hard sometimes for tramps to prove where they should be claiming assistance from. But the key thing about this example of these parish records are these are people struggling to make a living in very hard conditions in the 1900s, in the 1800s. They have a precarious living. If there's a problem with the fishing crop, if you will, or a problem with the crop on the land, there's very little flexibility in that type of living for where you go next and what you do and who you can turn to for support. And so that becomes quite apparent through these records. And there are some common themes there. There are women whose husbands are fishermen who have been lost at sea, and they're claiming on the poor relief system for money to bury the bodies. Things that you just wouldn't even think about. And then there are some more unusual ones. So an example is from 1894. I keep getting my 9s and 8s thrown around today, sorry. An example from 1894 applications. Thank you, Lily, for saying my pronunciation of Lerg is fine. So 1894 applications for poor relief from the parish of Kildonan. And they reveal a 13-year-old girl arriving in Kildonan parish. She is recorded as being deaf, dumb, and illiterate. And she's arrived by train in the parish. And because of her condition, she's unable to explain who she is, where she's come from, why she's there, how she got there. If you think to be deaf, dumb, and illiterate really takes away a lot of a person's ability to communicate in the 1800s, and she, if you compare that to today, where how you would take a photo of the person, you would put it up on social media, you would say that this person's arrived. That the police would have a very much quicker way of communicating with each other. But they have this girl who's arrived at the train station, and they just don't know who she is, where she's come from, and she's unable to tell them any of that information. And so it's recorded that they put her up in lodgings while the inspector of the poor investigated. He advertised in newspapers to see if anybody knew who she was. He wrote to every institution he could think of who might be dealing with children who were deaf or dumb. And eventually she was discovered to be a girl called Mary MacDonald, and she was the daughter of a Norman MacDonald in Ullapool. So she'd got right across the Highlands on a train, and I just think that's such an interesting insight into how difficult it would be to find out that information. Who's got responsibility for her, and how do they find out who she is and where to get her back to be safe? So she was 13, and obviously that seems young to us for someone to be claiming on their own on a poor relief system. But there are a lot of other children to be found in these poor relief records. Some go in for logical reasons, like their parents have died and they have nobody else to help them. Sometimes they go in for things like their parents have turned to alcohol and aren't able to look after them. I've even seen some where children, it just says their parents have gone to America and abandoned them. So they've just turned up at the door of the poor relief system and said, someone help us. For some areas, depending on what survived and what the extent of the number of children is, there are children's separate registers that record children as separate to the main registers, but that depends, as I say, on various things. There are also, sadly, some children who are just born into the system. There are children who are born in the poorhouses, who are born already on the poor relief system. And another example from the Kildonan records is of a 20-day-old baby who was born in Kildonan and was taken by his mother to Inverness, so that's no short journey, and left in a passageway in Tomnahurich Street, which is very odd to me because it's literally round the corner from where I'm sitting right now. And ever since I read that in those Kildonan Records, that strikes me every time I walk down Tomnahurich Street. I think, I wonder which doorway it was. I wonder what her story was and why she felt she had to do that. She was a domestic servant, so there are different stories that spring to mind there. But either way, she obviously was unable to carry on or to keep working with this baby. The baby was found, by the way, so survived. At the other end of the spectrum, and I like this story, also from the Kildonan Parish Records, there's the story of a 90-year-old crofter and tailor, John Mackintosh, who lived in West Helmsdale. I say it's a great story. I'm not sure quite what the reason for it was, but the inspector turned up at his door. The inspector turned up at his door to assess his claim for poor relief, but was turned out by Mackintosh, who said, "No, get out of here. I don't want your assistance." So he refused the parochial board's assistance of help. He said he'd never asked for any help. They could keep their help. He had no desire to be helped by people when he hadn't asked for it. Like, he'll decide what's going on in his life. I like that story, but I wonder, you wonder what the background is there. Had a concerned neighbour or person written to the poor relief and said, this gentleman needs help. I don't know, but I quite like the image of him going, "No, I'm got to 90, I don't need any of your help, thank you." Another sad thing that comes out of these stories is that some of them show a long, prolonged involvement with the system. And I'd like to tell you, just before I finish, the story of George McLennan and his wife Mary, who appear so frequently throughout the Inverness Poor Relief records that you get the feeling that just half of their life was spent in and out of the poor relief system, in and out of the poorhouse. George McLennan was first admitted in September 1864. He was only aged 26 when he went in, and he's described as very raggy and very dirty. And again, that's an interesting thing about these poor relief records, that you get a physical description of people as they go in. I think I remember saying in Asylum Week that although it's awful to think of these people going through these desperate times, from a retrospective point of view, it means we have descriptions of people who maybe otherwise you would have no record of them. The majority of people in the mid-1800s are kind of going through life leaving fairly little trace. And so if you have someone who's in these poor relief records, you have a description of them, and a tangible record, a legacy has been left of them. So yes, George is admitted age 26. It says that he's very raggy and very dirty. Mary, who was to become his wife, was admitted in 1867 to the Inverness poorhouse. She was single with a 6-month-old son. The son died aged 1.5 in the poorhouse. Their reason for going in is just listed as poverty. So there's no specific thing that has triggered this. They are just in a desperate state of poverty. George was listed as a weaver, but throughout his time in and out of the poorhouse, he's recorded as a labourer. He asks to leave so he can try and pursue a job in the herring industry. So every time he's out of the poorhouse, he is working, but he falls ill or something happens and he has to come back in. During his third admission to the poorhouse in 1871, it's recorded that George absconded. So when you go into the minutes to have a look at this to find out more about exactly what happened, it says that because he had left the poorhouse wearing the uniform that they were instructed to wear, so they got a set of clothes that they had to wear during their time in the poorhouse, he had absconded. He'd left wearing that outfit, and that had been classed as theft. Mary had, again, was in and out of the poorhouse, but had a particularly long stay from 1871 to 1881, a 10-year period to be in the poorhouse. Is quite substantial. And during that time, she gave birth to a second child, Thomas, and he also died at the age of 2. So that's certainly 2 children that we know of that she lost around about that age. It records that George and Mary married in 1881. by that point they had gone to Aberdeen, so they got married in Aberdeen. But they were both back in Inverness poorhouse by the following November. And Mary was listed as being pregnant again, but we have no further reference to what happened to that child. On the 30th of May 1884, not long after he had been released from the poorhouse, George returned again with a final illness. And he died in the poorhouse on the 27th of September 1884, almost exactly 20 years to the day after he had first entered the poorhouse. And as I say, it's not a typical story because they're in for such a long and extended period, but just to highlight that those stories are in there. So a lot of people are claiming temporarily on the system while they're going through a difficult time. But for some people, a large amount of their existence is spent in and out of that system. And I find that very, very sad to consider. But as I say, these records give an insight into social culture at the time, what was expected of people, what the depths to which they would pry into the family to prove, that they would to prove what was wrong with them, or to prove that they had a sufficient claim. Annabelle, I'm seeing your question, is there a cause of death for Mary's children? I haven't seen it in the poor relief records, but where are we looking? 1884. So it would be possible to find records of those deaths that would give a cause of death. So yeah, these records give an insight into social culture at the time. They give an insight into the beginning of the welfare state. They show people in moments of crisis and people whose lives are constantly on the edge. So they can be fascinating and interesting. They can sometimes make you smile when you see positive things coming out of it, and they can often make you quite tearful. But they are a wonderful, wonderful resource. Coverage across the whole of Scotland is up and down. It depends where you're looking. Certainly the Glasgow Poor Relief records are phenomenal, and if Irene O'Brien is watching, who's the archivist in Glasgow City, I know she is a very big advocate of their Poor Relief records. So if you have a Glasgow connection, they're definitely worth having a look at. Coverage for the other big cities is very, very sporadic. It just really depends. If you're interested in these records in particular, do drop us an email or send us a message, and we'll let you know if we have records for the area you're looking in. Before I round off, just to say one last time that the livecast is brought to you by High Life Highland at no cost to the viewer. High Life Highland is a charity registered in Scotland, and that this event requires no subscription and no payment. But I will say, as I did last week, if you are in a position to be able to donate towards the work of the Highland Archive Service, we would really, really appreciate that. The way we're working is very different at the moment, and will be, with so many industries, will be for the foreseeable future. My job usually involves going into schools, going into care homes or groups of community groups, and so all of that sort of thing is kind of up in the air at the moment, as so many industries are. So if you're able to donate, we would really appreciate that, to enable us to help looking after these collections, to keep looking after these collections and keep sharing them with people in whatever way we're able to do at the time. I hope you can join me next week. Next week I'm going to be looking at the Duncan Mcpherson collection, which is a phenomenal collection of photographs and information held in our Skye and Loch Alsh Archive Centre. As I said last week, I'm going to start taking examples from different areas in our collections, from different offices that we hold as well, different collections across the different offices, so you start to see a wide range of the things we care for. They are very diverse range of collections. So if you're able to join us next week, it would be great if you go on to our Facebook page and just mark that you're interested in attending, or that you're going to attend, and then you'll obviously get notifications about it as well. Thank you for all your messages coming up saying you're enjoying it. I'm really grateful to see those coming in. It's very, very much appreciated. So I'll hopefully see you all next week. Take care of yourselves.